welcome. Ben and Scott, obviously you're back again. Good to see you.
Yeah, good to be back.
Right.
Yeah, so today, man, we're going to talk about hospitals and object storage. So one of the big questions that we get to is, what do we need to know about the infrastructure of hospitals when we're thinking about object storage at hospitals? What do we need to know?
Complicated, man. Definitely. Complex. Vast. Big. Do you know what I mean? Lots and lots of legacy environments, legacy applications, legacy systems, disparate systems, things that don't talk to each other. Huge, I would say.
Yeah, and in my conversations, because we all know we do a lot of work in healthcare, we do a lot of work in object storage, so it's natural for us to try and connect the things. But in the conversations we have, where a lot of our work in healthcare is specifically around medical imaging, a lot of medical imaging applications are, they've been around a while, right? We might call them legacy applications. They're monolithic applications. They were originally built to work with file services and things like that. So right now, today, in the medical imaging space, there's not a huge amount of use for object storage with medical imaging, which is really interesting, because if you think about when we've spoken before about use cases for object storage, image files is the classic use case. So it's one of those, it's an obvious thing that you should be using object in hospitals around medical imaging, but they're not quite there yet. So that's definitely a thing I see around existing. I mean, I guess that's getting into applications that rather than just infrastructure.
That kind of gets me into the next bit, unless you want to touch on.
Well, I was going to say that if you think as well, I mean, part of the reason that potentially hospitals are still using traditional file platforms is because typically they're quite slow to move. They're quite slow. And it's not because they don't want to move. It's just because it's really complicated to move. Because everything's so disparate in different departments and everyone's doing different things and different applications. It's difficult to shift on. So, and that lack of adoption at speed means that they're still sitting on file platforms where there are better options such as object storage, and then we're starting to see that change.
And they're quite risk averse, because it is literally life and death.
Well, and
literally life and death.
Yeah.
So you don't want to be going first, going fastest, just trying out new stuff and hoping for the best. Like, they want technologies to be really mature, really stable. They need a very, very well thought through and structured plan to move from where they are today to what the future might look like, because I've said it 3 or 4 times
and that
already.
leans into the complexity, because equally those applications, those services that are being delivered will be complex, because they, unlike many other organizations, have been thinking about resilience and high availability and this sort of stuff from day one. So a lot of their older legacy applications, those monolithic kind of stacks of IT, are already highly available, resilient, and bits and pieces like that, but not necessarily using the latest and greatest technologies to achieve it.
So that leads me on, right? So if I'm a hospital, I'm a big hospital, I've got lots of data sitting across everywhere. If you're trying to sell it to me, object storage, how would you go about that? What would be the key indicators for me to say, actually, this is something I need to look at?
So an area where object storage is being used actively in hospitals and healthcare today, and we've seen this a number of times, is around the immutable backup sort of workload. We've all seen, certainly in the UK, really, really high profile stuff hitting the news about ransomware attacks on the NHS. It's happening all around the world.
That's huge.
Yeah, exactly. There's lots of research out there that suggests that oftentimes healthcare organisations are one of the primary targets for ransomware attacks, which, as savage as that sounds, that is the reality. So Object is a perfect destination for backup data and immutable backups to protect against ransomware attacks. So it's a quite a small pigeonhole tactical use case for Object, but it is something that is possible and relevant today. I know, Scott, you've been involved in some conversations recently around where Object is starting to be thought about for much, much bigger, more strategic initiatives.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think traditionally object storage, a lot of people, when they say object storage, they think backups. They think big archive platforms, cheap to scale, and that tends to be where most of that use cases.
Well, we used to have a saying when I was doing, calling under the desk and being a technical IT guy, a typical IT guy under the desk, cables, switches, routers, and all that stuff.
Definitely a typical IT guy.
More backups, right? Yeah. I haven't changed much, right? Let's be honest.
Once an engineer.
Always an engineer. So backups were a priority, but having done DR tests and that, there's nothing worse than going to a DR test. I never failed any because I'm that good. They were my backups.
Of course,
But
right. We all believe
no.
it.
My
No,
boss
no,
went
we
the
all
year
believe it.
before. No, honestly, I swear that.
It's not better praise than honest.
But I never failed the DR test. But the one thing that, because I used to have to look after the backups, but there's nothing worse in my eyes than going to a backup site. You've got a DR test, you've got teams of people turning up, you're trying to recover from tape. And that tape that you're trying to recover from, that was an incremental or it was a full backup, and something didn't go right in those backups, right? And then you're left with a situation where you can't recover. I would think the worst kind of recovery would be for me, where it's not mutable, like you say, where I've tried to recover from disk because I'm thinking, oh, no, we got this backup, we're all kind of good, we're all kind of safe. And then I put the ransomware back on the system. I don't know what you do at that point.
Well,
You're
that
in
is,
trouble.
and
Yeah.
that is,
I mean, you're in
that
trouble.
is,
Absolutely.
and that is the sad fact or the sad reality of ransomware attacks is most of the time, by the time you know there's a problem, that all of your backups, if you're keeping 30 days, 90 days, whatever, they're all infected, and that's exactly how they get you, because you think that's all right, I'll just roll back 60 days, and worst case I lose 60 days data. Well, guess what? They compromise your systems 90 days or 120 days ago, so you're knackered. But yeah, so that's, I mean, it's
It's a valid point though that you talk about tapes. I mean, that goes back to the whole conversation about hospitals running those legacy systems. I mean, we know that there are still a big percentage of hospitals that are using tape-based backup systems because the legacy platform or legacy system that they're using has no understanding of what object storage, doesn't even understand what file storage potentially is. Or network-based storage is. So we've still got people using backups. Time for recovery is awful because actually we've got to go and find the tapes, and we've got to actually data security of those things. I mean, in certain people are putting tapes in their pockets and taking them home because they're safe, right? You know what I mean? Things like that. So it's terrible. Whereas actually, in a world of scalable object storage, where we can just pull that stuff back straight off the network, it's secure. We've got an incredibly long time in which we can keep those backups for. That's part of it. But to your point about where do we see that going? So yeah, absolutely. So there's some conversations that I'm having at the moment where an example use case is more around AI, and this is all very sort of cloudy and fairy, and I don't know how many hospitals are heading down this road, but I do know of a really big project where they were pooling information from the medical imaging systems. They were pulling information from IoT devices, and I mean, what I mean is like door entry systems, lights, all kind of everything that's going on inside a hospital from hundreds of hospitals, pooling all that information into effectively a data lake, right? So this is another use case for object storage is where we were gathering incredible amounts of data, not necessarily because someone's going to sit there and tick through this stuff, but because we're going to apply AI to it. You're going to apply artificial intelligence. It's too much data. Exactly.
I'm not reading it.
So object storage, actually, one of the great use cases going forward with hospitals is to create this concept of data lake where we're dumping every tiny bit of data we know into something in the middle, and having computers analyze that data to understand how they can make improvements around workflow and judgments and things like that. So
no, I think that's really interesting because there is, I was perhaps a little harsh around some of the legacy nature of applications. Again, one of our big medical imaging vendors that we partner with today, had a lot of conversation with them recently. They absolutely have appetite to modernise their application stack, and so they've already built, for example, a cloud native VNA, vendor neutral archive element to their solution. They're re-architecting their entire platform to be cloud native. Now, whether you choose to run that in one of the hyperscalers or whether you choose to run that in an on-premises data center or with a service provider, it doesn't matter. But that whole modernization exercise does mean that you will be able to take advantage of object, and that simplistically means that they have massive scale at a really, really aggressive price point, which in healthcare is always a critical consideration because, again, we're biased a little towards the UK because we're very familiar with the NHS.
Yes.
That is different in different parts of the world, but the NHS, publicly funded healthcare, cost is always a massive issue. So there's absolutely appetite to move towards that, and we are seeing it.
And also, if you think about one of the great things in the hospital world, right? So we just had a pandemic, and the amount of data that the hospital had to collect, and suddenly we've got every, certainly in the UK, and I'm sure it's very similar in every country on the planet, was that every hospital pretty much had an engagement with every single person in the country.
And
Do you know
I've
what I mean?
also
And,
seen it's a
they've
really
never had that.
Yes.
So how do they store that data? Where did they store that data? Did their legacy systems and their file server, which was spec'd for the next 3 years, predict the fact that they were suddenly going to have to store 15, 20, 100 times as much data as they were expecting?
It's a really good point, because actually I was reading and you just played something in my mind. I was reading a case study a few weeks ago, and it was for AstraZeneca, who obviously produced one of the vaccines for COVID, and the case study was around a large enterprise storage vendor that they worked with in developing the vaccine, and they used Object to do a load of their sort of analysis and number crunching, all of that sort of genomic sequencing that needs to happen as part of developing a vaccine, and that was on a massive object storage infrastructure. And in that scenario, the vendor, and I know we like to remain neutral, so I won't name them, but they'd actually provided all of that at cost. So they deliberately made no money on it for the greater good. But it was just an interesting story. So
I don't know. AstraZeneca got a lot of profit. I would have probably gone in there for a bit extra.
yeah, I mean, let's not get into a debate about the ethics of business and shareholder value. I'm not ready. But it was just an interesting story, because again, although that's not necessarily in the hospital, it's absolutely healthcare related. Yeah.
And one of the things that I've noticed speaking to nurses and healthcare professionals is that at the moment they've got a huge backlog of paperwork that needs to be scanned and needs to be put into storage. So they're not even quite there yet.
Yeah, digitalization.
Digitalization.
It's only a case. It's only a matter of time in terms of getting all of those paper records copied off, digitized, stored somewhere. Where you're going to store it? You're going to store it on those old legacy NAS systems. Let's not forget as well, one of the great things about object storage is that it doesn't have to be in the hospital.
Correct.
Right? It can be accessed from all the hospitals, all over the world, all over the place, because it's natively talking in web, HTTP traffic, in web conversational traffic, S3 protocols that can be hit across. If I've got a little NAS sat in the corner of my doctor's surgery, or sat in the corner of the hospital with an old legacy file system, that's great for all doctors that are in the hospital. But how are we engaging with that? Actually, being able to go and pick that data up, securely transport it across the internet, some big number crunching public cloud somewhere, then there's a lot of arguments to say why should we be looking at changing our storage approach in healthcare.
Awesome. So I think that's a good case for object storage. I mean, have you got anything else you'd like to input for us today, or?
No, I think the only thing I'd put out there is, obviously we mentioned it right at the beginning, like reliability, high availability, all of those things around the object storage platform, and obviously it's great us having an amazing storage platform that can do all these amazing things, but if it's not resilient, if it's not accelerated in terms of its application, in terms of what it can offer, and it's not highly available, then what's good in having an object storage system?
I think we've done an awesome job of. It's taken us at least 5 minutes to get to talking about load balance.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I think we should celebrate that and end there.
Well done.
Exactly
well done, guys.
Well, that was my little dig at load balancer, right? We need a load balancer.
We need a load balancer.
We've got to get it in.
We definitely need a load balancer.
Exactly that.
All right, brilliant. Cheers, guys.
Cheers,
Thank you very much.
Guys, enjoyed
Thank
it.
you.